For anyone who's not familiar with the wonderful T.G. Klune, let me briefly introduce him. T.G. Klune is an American author of fantasy and romantic fiction. His works emphasize positive gay and LGBTQ plus characters. The Fabulous House in Cerulean Sea is a New York Times bestseller and was a nominee for the 2021 Mythopic Fantasy Award for Adult Literature and won the Alex Award winner. And just released is his latest afterlife fantasy novel, Under the Whispering Door. His other books include Bear, Otter and the Kid, Burn, Lambada, which won the Lambada Award, Into This River I Drown, Moderation, The Bones Beneath My Skin, Wolf Song, Raven Song, Heart Song, and Brother Song, The Lightning Struck Heart, A Destiny of Dragons, The Consumption of Magic, A Wish Upon the Stars, Fairy Tales from Verenia, and The Extraordinaires, which has a sequel just coming up, Flashfire. It was The House in the Cerulean Sea, though, that has become his big breakout book, climbing high into the bestseller lists, and the follow-up, Under the Whispering Door, has again followed, featuring strongly on international bestseller lists. A very warm New Zealand and Wellington welcome, TJ.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure. Can I initially start by asking you some questions about Under the Whispering Door, move on to The House in Cerulean Sea, and then perhaps end in a few general questions, and perhaps, if we're really lucky, a short reading at the end.
Absolutely.
Under the Whispering Door, your latest novel, is a fabulous fantasy story which deals with, I think, universal themes. It's kind of about a ghost who refuses to cross over and the ferryman and his team tasked with helping him. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were thinking about, hoping to achieve with this book when you started work on it?
This book has been with me in some form or another. This story has been with me in some form or another for years and years and years. And there was a time when I had this idea of taking on the bureaucracy of the afterlife and what that would look like if there would be paper pushers, middle managers. It just seemed like a setting ripe for understanding the bureaucratic process that could be part of the afterlife. But as sometimes happens, somebody got there first and did that idea better, which turned out to be the American television show, The Good Place, which I absolutely adored from start to finish. But it tackled many of the same questions that I was thinking about. And not only that, but did it much better than I ever could. So I kind of had to put this aside for a little bit. It wasn't until I was reading Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol for the first time that I kind of saw it from a different light. Christmas Carol obviously is a well-known story. It follows Ebenezer Scrooge, a not so very nice man who is visited by spirits who help him change the course of his life by showing him his faults. And at the very end, everything is wonderful. Everything is happy and he's a good person all of a sudden. And it always struck me that you never saw Scrooge doing the work to trying to become a better person. It's at the very end, it's like a switch has flipped and he is all of a sudden the best person that's ever existed. And obviously Dickens is a master for a reason and is considered a master, and his works are classics for a reason. But I couldn't shake the idea of what would it look like if a man like Scrooge died and then was forced to shine a light on all his fallacies in life and what kind of person he was without the power necessarily to do much of anything to change it. So I started writing, and not only was Christmas Carol a big jumping off point for me, the idea of grief is something so universal. Even though no two people will experience grief the same way, if you live long enough to learn what love is, you'll eventually know what loss is. That's just a part of life. For every life, there is death. And I can't say that I've been affected any more or less by death than any other normal person in the world. But I did lose my partner a few years ago. He ended up passing away unexpectedly. And Under the Whispering Door in addition to me wanting to write about this not so very nice man named Wallace, was also me trying to explore the remains of my grief that I had left over, the grief that I had never been able to shake, because grief is such a weird thing. It never ever truly goes away. It calcifies and petrifies in your chest and hardens into this knot. But while it doesn't hurt as much as it once used to, every now and then it can crack open and remind you of the pain that you once felt. It may not feel as badly as it did before, but it's always going to be there. And so I did what I do best, which is write through it. And by the time I finished the novel, I was able to fully understand my loss and the loss that his friends and families, his friend and family also went through. And I was able to find some kind of catharsis. I don't want to say closure because I think that's a myth. I don't know, like grief, I don't know if there's ever truly closure, but I was able to find some semblance of peace by the time I finished the novel.
Yeah. You've described Under the Whispering Door as a comedy about grief, and you've talked really eloquently about the grief aspect, but it's also a very funny book in places.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us about how you went about walking that line between grief and comedy. They're not natural they don't naturally sit together, but
yeah, absolutely. And it is a very tricky line to walk, because if you try to inject humor in the wrong moment or too much of it, it can feel like you're making light of very heavy issues, especially when it comes to the idea of mortality. But at the same time, if we can't laugh at ourselves and if we can't laugh over the absurdities of life, then what are we even doing? We're not going to get through life without laughing at ourselves and certain situations. I mean, everybody has been at the end of their rope at one point or another, throw their hands up in exasperation and just laugh through it, because that's how we cope. And so marrying the idea of comedy and grief isn't necessarily as hard as one might think, just as long as you don't take away from one aspect or the other. I don't ever want to make love a certain situation, or I never want to have humor destroyed because all of a sudden we need to get into this really heavy moment that I've been building towards. To me, to marry these two, it has to come organically. It has to feel like real life, because real life is an hysterical tragedy. It is, we are lifted as high up as a human can possibly be, only to be crashed back down to earth the very next second. So there is a line to walk, but I don't think it's as difficult as most people believe, because of the fact that life is funny and life is sad, sometimes all at the same time.
Under the Whispering Door does ask really profound questions. And I think the most profound question it asks is, what does it mean to be a good person in life? Does the book cover what your response to that question would be?
I think in part it does. I think I don't know exactly what it means to be a good person. I think, like grief, where it's different for everyone, the idea of what means a good person or what entails it to be a good person, you get, if you ask 10 different people, you get 10 different answers. I think that it's how I live my life, I should say, is not trying to be a good person, because again, I don't know exactly what that looks like, but trying to be a better person. Each day I try to be a little bit better than the day I was before. Do I always succeed? No, I don't, of course, because again, I'm human and I fail all the time. But as so long as I keep on trying to be a better person than I was the day before, then maybe I'm doing okay. And that's kind of the thought process that I went into with Wallace's character arc. What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a terrible person? And what would the line look like to that connects the two? What would that journey look like? If I had to put it down into one sentence about what I think a good person is or what they do, I think it's people that live with empathy and live in service of helping others, not for any accolades or any recognition, but just for the sake of helping others and doing the right thing.
You've already told us that the book is a deeply personal work, and obviously touches your heart in many ways. Can I ask you a question? Did you ever feel there was a pressure to change the book, to maybe make it more commercial? either from within yourself and say, actually, I don't want to go there because it won't make the book commercial, or perhaps from your publisher or editors?
No, absolutely not. And that's wonderful. By when I say absolutely not, I mean my publisher I am in a very unique and privileged position that I get to tell the stories I want to tell. I don't ever think about what people want to read, because no matter what I do, no matter what I write, there will be somebody who loves it, somebody who likes it, somebody who dislikes it, and somebody who hates it. That's their right. That's their right to have an opinion. And if you have obtained my book by legal means, either from a bookstore, from a library, anything in that regard, you are allowed to have any opinion you want about the book. The book no longer belongs to me. The characters no longer belong to me. It belongs to the world. That being said, I don't write what I think people want to read. If you think of your most favorite book in the world, a book that you can read over and over again, a book that you love with your whole heart, and then go to Goodreads and look at the 1-star reviews for that book and see what others think of that book. It shows you that no matter what you do, no matter what you write, there will be somebody who likes it and there will be somebody who doesn't. And if you try to please everyone, you'll end up pleasing no one. And I think that that's important for authors to remember. So when I write the stories I want to tell, the stories I wish I could have read when I was a kid or a teenager growing up in the 80s and 90s and coming into my queerness and not being able to see myself in the books or media that I consumed. And when it comes to the publisher themselves, they have given me free rein to tell the stories I want to tell. And again, I know I'm very lucky in that regard, but I have never felt pressure to change a story to make it more commercial or to think about what common reader Joe would think about my book, because by the time it gets to them, I've already told the story I want to tell, and I'm not thinking about changing it for anyone.
You can tell the strength of the book is that kind of honesty in approach, I think. You also ask another very fundamental question under the Whispering Door, and that's what will we do with the time we have left, and how do we prioritize that? How important was it for you to explore that theme in this book?
It was very important, not just for the characters and the story arc that Wallace Price goes through, but for myself too, because, you know, after my partner passed away, I think, especially during the time that he was sick, unexpectedly, I was in this holding pattern. I was in stasis. Because so much was unknown. We didn't know what was going on. And then after his passing, it just felt, I don't know, I felt aimless, and that I was wandering, and I couldn't think, I couldn't focus, I couldn't do what I was supposed to be doing. And then when I started writing this book and that question came up, it wasn't a question I necessarily thought of in the planning stages of the book, but as I got to it, as I was writing it, I typed that question as part of the manuscript: what will you do with the time you have left? And that became a bigger thing for me, because it goes back to being the idea of being a better person every day, because nobody knows how long they have. You could have 50 more years, or you could have until tomorrow. What are you going to do with that time? What are you going to do with the time you have on Earth? Some people seem to think that their time on Earth is meant to be selfish and cruel and destroy as many people as they possibly can. And then you have other people who are the helpers, who are the quiet ones, who don't get the same news coverage as maybe the people who are trying to destroy everything do. But I think about that a lot now. I turned 40 years old next year, and I think about, what would I do with the time I have left? What do I want to do with the time I have left? What does it mean to try and incorporate the idea of being a better person with the time I have left? And I think it's something that people think of not necessarily straight on, but they'll think of it in a cursory. You hear about somebody's passing that maybe you didn't know very well, and you think, oh, that's the poor family, the poor person. And then you think, maybe in the back recesses of your mind, what would I do if that happened to me? What would I do if I knew an end date was coming? What would I do with the time I have left? And for most people, that thought just kind of disappears in the morass of the mind. But for me, it's been at the forefront of my thoughts for a while now. And I think it's something that people should ask themselves. And does it mean they need to prioritize their lives differently? No, absolutely not. But just to make sure that you're doing what you set out to do with your life, that you are happy with your life, and not only happy, but you are fulfilled.
Without giving too much of the plot away, tea and blending of tea and the growing of tea plays a very central role in Under the Whispering Door. Are you a tea buff, or was that just research?
No, I am a tea buff, absolutely. And it's funny because living in America, I live in such a coffee culture that somebody who drinks tea, I don't know if it just if it goes all the way back centuries and we're still angry about all the tea that we threw into the Boston Harbor. I don't know, but it is. I live in a very coffee centric culture, but I have always drank tea. I have loved tea, and the idea of tea blending with the idea of mortality and death seemed very fitting to me. I'll have logic connections in my mind that might not make sense to others, but kind of make sense to me. For example, death has always been a part of life. So it's been around as long as people have been alive. As long as there's been living organisms, there's been death. And tea is one of the oldest drinks consumed in the world. It is the second most popular drink in the world after water. Third is beer. But tea has been around for thousands of years. And what I love about tea is that almost every culture on earth has their own versions of tea, has their own rituals when it comes to tea that are separate from everywhere else, sort of like with the idea of death. Everybody has their own beliefs in what happens after we die. Everybody has their own ceremonies that they do with people. And so it just seemed in my head, this puzzle piece that just clicked together and locked into place, that tea obviously would play a role in people who are in the idea of death and dying. I went to the UK in 2016 for a month. And when I came back, I used to be one of those blasphemers who heated tea water in the microwave. But as soon as I came back from the UK, I bought myself an electric kettle, and that's how I've warmed my tea or heated my tea water ever since. But the growing of tea was different, and that's something I did have to research because I was not familiar with the growing of tea. I am the type of person who will just go to the store and buy it in the box or order it online.
New Zealand and Wellington's very much coffee culture as well. But I have a very good friend actually who blends teas, and so she will make. So my favorite is things like lapsang souchong or burnt rice tea at the moment. So can I ask you what blend of tea are you connected to at the moment?
The tea that I'm connecting to at the moment is the British tea. It's PG Tips black tea, and it is basic, but I love black tea. There's also a brand here in the States that does their own version of black tea with hints of oranges and spices in the background that I drink, I consume en masse. So.
I believe you worked in the insurance industry before becoming a full-time writer.
Yeah.
Did that experience influence the creation of any of the characters in Under the Whispering Door? Say perhaps Wallace? And how did that process work, taking things from your personal life and putting it in a fictional context?
Yeah, so I worked for an automobile insurance company handling the worst of the worst accident claims, where people were severely injured or unfortunately passed away, or even when there was litigation involved. I think that the house in the Cerulean Sea probably has a bit more of a connection to my former employer, or my former line of work, I should say, just because Linus Baker, the main character in that book, is a middle bureaucratic man who works basically in cubicle hell, which is what I did for many, many years. Wallace is more of the manager level of those types of, he's the boss, he's the one you go to, he's the one that nothing goes by. And while in both books, I lightly skewer corporate culture, I didn't want to go too hard on Wallace because I knew, because there's something about him being unlikable in the first chapters. But that can also be a tricky line to walk, because if you make someone too unlikable, it doesn't give the reader anyone to root for. But if you absolve them of their sins too quickly, it doesn't feel, their arc doesn't feel earned. So with Wallace, I had to walk that line of him being a jerk, but also maybe there are shadows of redemption that we just can't quite see yet. And so Wallace wasn't necessarily based on my level of employee that I used to work, but more so the bosses above me, who everything has to be done a certain way, or you get basically in trouble with your boss. And so I had a little bit of fun making sure that Wallace was brought down low, and everything that he thought he had was stripped away.
Can I ask you a little bit about the character, the manager in Under the Whispering Door? Very mysterious character. And again, if I give too much away, could you tell a little bit about, were you thinking about certain mythological characters when developing that character? Or was that pure raw imagination on your behalf?
That was imagination. I knew that for those who've read the book, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers as much as possible. Think of the manager as the big boss. Think of the manager as not just Hugo and May's boss, but potentially the boss of the universe. But he's not, as is hinted at, he's not the top rung of that ladder. He is not the be all and the end all. I knew going into it that he was going to have a form that showed him very differently than his real form in the book. And I wanted to have somebody that felt close to what this being's approximation of what a human being would act like, but just be off enough to have this otherworldly feel about him, because he is very unusual, especially in his current form. In the book, he appears as a child, in addition to another embodiment that he has that is not quite human. And there's something fascinating about having a character as a child, that it is this huge, mysterious, magnificent being that is as old, or so he says, as old as the universe. But what I love about him is, yes, he's this powerful being who is very quite clearly, as he says, not God, but he also is still in the body of a child. So there's a scene where he has to drag a chair over so he can sit with the adults that he's sitting with at the table, and he has his tongue sticking out between his teeth and he's climbing up on the chair just like a kid. And it creates this illusion of innocence. But then he opens his mouth and all of that is wiped away, because he is very calculating and very, very intelligent, and does not think much of Wallace Price. He does care in his own way about his employees, May and Hugo, but he is, again, the idea of management. He is the boss, and he doesn't necessarily care about his employees as people. He cares about the bottom line.
May, you just mentioned that, the Friendly Reaper, is a really memorable character. Like, she's sassy and sharp and funny. How did you go about creating her? Is she kind of composite of real people, or again?
No, she's purely, I try to avoid basing characters off of real people, because that line, for me at least, can blur just a little bit. And it can get to a point where I have to start having conversations with myself about what is ethical and what is not. So I tend to avoid basing characters, at least fully, on real people. May is a product of my imagination, and she was created and she was brought into this because I needed a counterpoint to Hugo. Hugo is this empathetic, beautiful, wonderful character who is kind and loving and very good at what he does as the ferryman, whose job it is to help souls put to rest. And May is his reaper. She's the one who brings the souls to him. And given how heavy certain parts of this book would be, I knew, and given that the main character Wallace was a jerk, I knew I needed to have levity in the book. And that came in the form of May, who is just starting out being a reaper on her own, and Nelson, who is Hugo's grandfather. They kind of play this comedy tag team duo and act almost as a Greek chorus in the background as Hugo and Wallace become closer and closer. And she is there. At first, she was there just to be comedic relief. But as usually happens with me, I began to grow fond of her as I wrote her character and wrote her story. And even though she was initially brought up with the idea of being the comedic relief, I wrote the depths to her, the depths to her and to Nelson, because nobody in this novel, of the five main characters, you have Wallace, you have Hugo, you have Nelson, you have May, you also have a ghost dog named Apollo. All five of those characters undergo an arc through the story, and not just Wallace. And they are not the same people who they were when the story starts. And it was a delight and an honor to be able to write a character like May.
Can I ask, are there any thematic connections between Under the Whispering Door and the House in the Cerulean Sea? I'm thinking of like there's a lot to do with friendship and acceptance and love and advocacy and things like that. Were you thinking about that?
Yeah, I consider Under the Whispering Door and the House in the Cerulean Sea to be sort of bookends for each other. They're both part of what I call my unofficial kindness trilogy. Unofficial because they're not necessarily connected in the world that they share, but they are united in certain themes. The House in the Cerulean Sea was about showing kindness to others. Under the Whispering Door is about something I think is much harder, and that's showing kindness to yourself. The third book, which comes out next year, I think next fall, is also explores a theme of kindness, but it's about being kind to people who may not deserve it, and in fact, arguably do not deserve kindness. I wrote these three books almost back to back to back because I wanted to explore these kinds of themes in different settings with different people just to see how they would react. Linus is in over his head because he thinks the world is a certain way, and then he finds out it's not. Wallace is in over his head because he thought death would be the end, and sure as shit, it is not the end at all. And then my third book, I won't go into that as of right now, as we haven't formally announced it as of yet, but it does explore some of the same themes, and it forms this trilogy of sorts that are loosely connected thematically.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to reading that third installment.
Yeah, it is something entirely different. It's a queer retelling of Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio.
Oh, wow.
So I am super excited about that book because it's something entirely different from House in the Cerulean Sea and Under the Whispering Door.
We've been talking a little bit about the House in the Cerulean Sea, which I loved as well. It's a novel that focuses on themes of healing, inclusion, finding out who you really are at core. It has been described as a Joyce hug of a book, and I would agree with that description. Was it making it that kind of uplifting, compassionate read part of your main thinking behind the creation of it?
It was. Well, to an extent. I wrote that book back in 2017, and if you lived in the United States in 2017, you know that we were not doing very well. Leadership and the evil of people was on full display all over the world, on the news, on the internet, and I was getting tired of being fed outrage every single day. Anytime I turned on the TV, anytime I went on Twitter, this bad thing was happening or this bad thing was happening. Has it gotten better? Well, here we are, almost 2 years into a global pandemic. So not really. But the reason I wanted to write The House in the Cerulean Sea at first was because I thought it was going to be this searing takedown of bureaucracy and complacency. And then I started writing it and I realized that it wasn't supposed to be that kind of book. It was supposed to be gentler. It was supposed to be like books that I used to read growing up, cozy fantasy, like Diana Wynne Jones' Howl's Moving Castle is one of my all-time favorites. And we don't get to really see that in fantasy anymore because, and there's a place for it, but it seemed to me that at the time, everything was Game of Thrones, grimdark. Everything was swords and evil and people getting slaughtered and killed and armies going to war and dying. And I just wanted to write a story where I could feel happy, where I could write about something that did not necessarily feel weightless, but and could still very well deal with some serious themes such as bigotry and complacency. But I wanted to make it softer and gentler. And I think it was because I wanted to read about goodness. I wanted to read about kindness. I wanted to spend time with people I could laugh with and be happy with. And so that's why the book ended up as it did. And I mean, obviously, I didn't know what to expect when it came out or what the world would look like when it did. Maybe we'd all live in this utopia and everything would be wonderful and happy and everybody be like, we don't need happy books. But it came out in March of 2020, and literally the book came out the week the pandemic exploded in the United States. So I am very aware of how much that book meant to people at that time and have meant to people since then. And though I wish the world had been in a much different place, I think that book came out exactly when it was meant to.
Yeah, I think it was the perfect time for that book too.
Mm-hmm.
Another one of the key themes in that book is that people fear what they don't understand. And in the book, you propose approaches to counteract people's fear of difference. Tell us about how important it was to get that message across.
It's very important. We live in our own, as Linus does, and as it says in the books, we live in bubbles of our own making. We do, everybody. It doesn't matter where your politics lie. It doesn't matter what job you have or what kind of business you're in, what community you're in, what religion you're in. People fear what they don't understand. And that fear can lead to anger. And that anger can lead to all manner of things that we've seen quite clearly. And I won't speak for anywhere else in the world, but I will speak for the United States. We've seen that anger on full display in the United States. We've seen what that fear can do to people. It poisons them. It makes them desperate. It makes them violent. It makes them evil in a way. And I mean, I just don't know if people even can grasp that and understand that why do you hate this certain segment of the population? Do you even know? Is it because you're so stuck in your own echo chamber that all you hear is the same talking points that you've spouted yourself time and time again? Why do people hate queer people? Is it because of their religion? Well, isn't your God supposed to be an all-loving, all-knowing God who recognizes that humanity will sin, but we can be forgiven for our sins? Why do people who die by suicide in religion, in certain lines of religion, why do people who die by suicide automatically go to hell? Why is that a thing? Why are we not showing understanding? Why are we not showing empathy? Why are we not showing kindness to people who need it? And I don't know. It seems like that for every step forward that we make as a society and as a whole, we're always just going to be taking 2 steps back almost at the exact same time. And will we ever be free of that kind of fear? No, I don't know if we ever will. And frankly, I don't know if we even could, how that would even go about being done. That there's going to be no such thing as a utopic society in my lifetime, because there's too many people out there with too many opinions who think that they're right and find people to help amplify those opinions. But if we can help one person at a time, then you know what? That's maybe where we have to start.
I love all the characters in the House in the Cerulean Sea, but if I was pushed, I'd say my favorite character is Chauncey, who outwardly is the most unhuman character, but inwardly is has the most positive of all human characteristics. I think it's safe to say is a ray of human sunshine. Can you tell me about your creation of that character and your intentions behind the outward surface and the inward beauty?
Yeah, so Chauncey is also my favorite character. I adore that little green blobby boy. He is, yeah, I've said it before, and like you just said, he is sunshine. He is a sunny day. He does not let what other people think of him get him down. He is optimistic, maybe to a fault, but also he's a child. He's a kid. And what I love about him as a character and why I think he's my favorite is in The House in the Cerulean Sea, he has a very fervent desire to be one thing and one thing only. He wants to be a bellhop. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist because of watching Indiana Jones. I wanted to go on adventures where I would get to find hidden treasure and punch Nazis, because that's how I thought archaeologists were. I became so focused on the idea of archaeology that I'd read anything I could get my hands on about archaeology. I would go to the library and check out as many books as possible about being an archaeologist, because when you're a kid, you become obsessed over certain things and they become all you know. And that's how Chauncey is. He is this blob with tentacles for arms and eyes on stalks on the top of his head, but he's also still a kid who just wants one thing, and that's to be a bellhop. And I love his innocence behind him and how he refuses to let anybody get in the way of his dream. He knows that there are not good people out there. He's witnessed them up close and personal. He's been told he's a monster because of how he looks. But the one thing he wants to do is to be a bellhop, because that means he can talk to people face to face and help them with their bags and welcome them to a hotel.
Are the locations in the House of Cerulean Sea based on anywhere in particular? They reminded me a little bit of Italy or maybe Spain, but I was just wondering if there was
not anything in particular. I think that the city that Linus first lived in, and when the book opens, is meant to not so subtly be London. But other than that, everything else is not necessarily based on a specific place.
The fact that all the children in the House of Cerulean Sea are all friends gives the book a huge amount of hope. Again, the theme of friendship was one I take it you were particularly keen to explore in the book.
Yeah, so all of these kids, there are 6 children in the story. It's Talia, it is Chauncey, it is Theodore, it is Sal, it is Fee, and it is Lucy. And they have all experienced the trauma of people before they came to this island. They have seen humanity at its worst when it comes to dealing with magical beings and dealing with children who also are magical beings. So when they get to this island, and by the time the main character Linus arrives, they've already been at the island. Most of them have been at the island for a good while. I knew that having them have faith and trust and love in each other was going to be the only way to go about it. Because these kids have been, like Chauncey, have been told their whole lives that they're evil, that they're monsters, that they're terrible people, or not even people, that they're terrible creatures who will bring about the end of the world, and they should be looked down upon, they should be spat upon. And I wanted them to not have to doubt each other. So through thick and thin, the one thing that I made sure of was that none of these children, A, could be harmed physically when I was writing the book, and B, they couldn't be separated from each other. They couldn't, one of the children couldn't be taken from the island somehow, because they've already been through enough. Yes, most of it happened off page, but I didn't want to traumatize them further. And I think it goes beyond friendship. As Lucy says in the book, these are his brothers and his sisters. This is his family. And it is the family, all the family that they need. And I love that they have each other to fall back on, and it's done so without question.
Yeah. I want to ask a question that's linked to that, and also linked to the Under the Whispering Door, and that's the question of advocacy and speaking up and supporting others. It comes strong through both of these books. Can you tell me us a little bit more about exploring ideas of advocacy in your work?
Yeah, so we are living in a wonderful age of fiction, and not just in science fiction and fantasy. We are living in a wonderful age of fiction, but that comes with a caveat. Last year, I participated in or the year before, I participated in a Twitter trend that was called Publishing Paid Me. And basically the point of it was to show the disparity that white authors make versus authors of color in terms of advances, in terms of royalties, in terms of marketing, in terms of what they get. And I have to recognize that I have a privilege because of the color of my skin. I'm a white man. Yes, I'm queer, but being queer does not equate what a person of color goes through in their day-to-day life. So with the idea of advocacy, we're seeing more and more of a push for diversity in fiction. It's well done in young adult fiction, particularly. Young adult fiction is at the forefront of diversity at the forefront. Do we still have a lot more to do? Absolutely. But we are seeing more and more authors from marginalized communities getting a seat at the table, being able to tell their own story. Adult fiction still has a ways to go. We are not quite there yet. I don't know when and if we will be, but I think that with adult fiction that we need to be more diverse, because for a very long time, science fiction and fantasy, the genre itself was a straight white male game, and other stories were not told in the straight white male books. So what do I do best? I'm a queer man, and I've spent my entire life knowing I was queer, and I know what I've done to fight for my rights. I mean, people think that we live in 2021, and so the world must be much more progressive than it was, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago when I was a kid. But it was just 6 years ago in 2015 that queer people got the right to legally marry in this country. And I remember after the Supreme Court decision came down giving us the right to marry, some smart person online said, well, I guess homophobia is over now. And, obviously people jumped down their throat, but there a lot of people thought that now queer people can do everything that straight people can, so they must have it easy. But that's not how it works. That's not how the world works. So I am always pushing, lifting up other people, making sure their voices are heard, speaking out for them, but not to the point in which we bury their own voices. Because I think a lot of white advocates who practice trying to help marginalized communities sometimes forget that you need to let the people from those communities talk. You're doing all the talking for them. Why aren't you letting them raise their voice and say what needs to be said? You don't speak for them. If you want to help, sometimes the best thing you can do is shut up and let other people do the talking. So I will continue to fight for diversity, to push for diversity in my books and in the real world.
Thank you. There are lots of memorable scenes in the house in the Cerulean Sea, but I'm a big muso, and I love the scene in the record shop. I was wondering if you're a big muso yourself, and if you have a favorite record shop.
I do. Unfortunately, where I live in Virginia, in the town that I live in, I don't have any record shops here. But there was back where I used to live in Tucson, there was a delightful indie record store that I used to go to before it closed down. Records are becoming, I don't want to say it, but records are becoming harder and harder to come across. I don't want to say they're becoming obsolete, because that hurts my heart, because I grew up listening to records. Look, right now, you can go online and download any song you want to. It'll come through crystal clear, that it'll be produced within an inch of his life, and you can bet you're hearing the best sound you have ever heard for that particular song. But there is nothing like the sound of music coming from a record. There is nothing like that sound. There's the hiss, there's the click, There's the singing, the voices that are not overproduced, and it sounds like, as Lucy says, dead people music. It sounds like ghosts singing sometimes. And I just love the sound of a record far and above any sound that you can get downloading a song or streaming it, just because there's just something, I don't know, maybe it's just for the fact that I grew up in households with large record collections that I prefer to listen. Is it to listen to music that way? Is it always feasible? No, of course not. I mean, you're not going to find the top big artists of the day releasing records for you to listen to their music to. But there's just something about putting that record on and lowering the arm with the needle and getting ready to hear that sound. The anticipation is just delightful and marvelous.
Another thing I love about The House in the Cerulean Sea is how vividly drawn nature is in the natural world. Again, I was wondering, is that a personal interest or was that research? Because
that was research. I will kill any plant I touch, and that is unfortunate, but it is true. So with The House in the Cerulean Sea, and to a greater extent even with Under the Whispering Door, these novels mostly take place in one location. With The House in the Cerulean Sea, it's the island. With the Under the Whispering Door, it's a tea shop. And if these locations don't feel like real characters unto themselves, the reading experience can start to become claustrophobic for the reader, especially when you're writing a character-driven novel set primarily in one location. So I needed to make these locations feel as vibrant and as alive as humanly possible, because this is where the reader was going to be spending all of their time with these characters. So I paid special attention to, in both novels, the setting itself, because I wanted to make sure that it felt vivid, that it felt vibrant, that it felt like it was leaping off the page. And not only that, but it has, to me at least, it has a very cinematic quality to it. Both novels do, because I want the reader to almost be able to see everything with their own eyes rather than just the words. I want them to be able to see the colors. I want them to be able to hear the sounds of the ocean. I want them to be able to hear the birds in the trees. And I hope that translates well, but I have this whole cinematic vision in my head of how the island looks and what it looks like to pull up on the Merle's boat, and what it looks like to drive through the trees, what it looks like to see the house sitting on the cliff. So that all came from imagination, but it did come from a heavy level of research to find out what kind of plants and trees and stuff would be native to an island in some kind of tropical setting.
I totally agree. Like, the cinematic quality of your books comes across really strongly, which leads to a very obvious question. Have you had any movie or TV interest in your works? Because they just dying to be made into a Pixar movie.
Legally, I cannot confirm or deny what has been done to this point, but I will say that hopefully we'll see it adapted sooner rather than later.
That's fabulous. That's fabulous. Yes. There's a question I always like to ask every author I interview, and that's the books that you read as a child, that you read as a teenager, that made you a writer, the ones that are passionate to, authors you love, books you love.
Yeah, so I already mentioned Diana Wynne Jones, Howl's Moving Castle. It's one of my absolute favorites. I am a very, very big Stephen King fan. I've read him since I was 10 years old. And, you know, long live the king. He's in his 70s. He's still putting out 1 or 2 books a year. And if I could be that prolific when I reach that age, then I think I'd be doing okay. Particularly his novel, The Dead Zone. The Dead Zone is one of my favorite novels of all time. It is not necessarily horror, but it is a profoundly moving thriller that anytime I read, I find something new about it. Another book that I loved as a kid, and in fact, I still read it once a year just to see if it'll hit me the same way it had, is Where the Redfern Grows by Wilson Rawls. And if you don't know that book, let's just say it is one of those books It's about a boy growing up in the 30s, 40s in the Ozarks, which is a mountain range here in the United States. Very, very rural area. And he grows up with two red tick coonhounds that he grows up with. And if you know the Redfern, where the Redfern grows, you know that it is one of the saddest books ever written, because it is the literal definition of do the dogs die in this book. It's the reason why I have trauma now. Anytime I see a book or a movie that features a dog, I have to know if the dog lives, because my own dog who's staring at me right now, who I based Apollo on in Under the Whispering Door, I cannot have dogs dying in books that I consume in movies or TV show. So it's weird that Where the Redfern Grows is still one of my favorite, but I think Where the Redfern Grows was one of the first times, well, I know for a fact it was the first time I had ever cried when reading a book. And it was one of the first times I realized the power that words have, that I could become so emotionally connected to Billy and his two dogs that anything that happened to them, I felt like it was happening to me. And so I read that book once a year to see if it still hits me as hard as it does. And yes, it does. Every single time. I know what's happening, but I already know that I'm going to be crying my eyes out by the time I get to the ending.
I have just one last question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what your perfect dream day would entail?
Oh my gosh. I have been so busy for the last couple of years. I don't know that I've ever actually got to have my perfect dream day. It would be getting a full night's sleep, waking up at not 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, but maybe 9 o'clock, not having to answer any emails the entire day, and going out in nature with my dog. We have this path that we walk through in the woods that sometimes takes an hour, and sometimes I could spend 5-6 hours out there. Now that's where I go to puzzle out all my problems I'm having with writing a book. That's where I go to think, or that's sometimes where I go not to think. But a perfect day for me is with my dog out in the middle of nowhere in nature, because I love being outside. I love being surrounded by trees, not necessarily being surrounded by other people, but just being there in the sunshine and taking a breath and relaxing and realizing, you know what, I've got it pretty good.
TJ Klune, thank you very much. That was fabulous. Yep.
Okay, but this is from Under the Whispering Door, and this is a scene after Wallace shortly arrives to the tea shop for the first time, being brought after being meeting his reaper at his poorly attended funeral for the first time. He's taken to this tea shop, and this is what he sees. The entire place felt like a fever dream. It couldn't be real. It was too something that Wallace couldn't quite put his finger on. He stopped in front of the display case, staring at the message on the chalkboard, unable to look away. Unable, that was, until a dog ran out of a wall. He shrieked as he stumbled backward, not believing his eyes. The dog, a large black mutt with a white pattern on its chest that almost looked like a star, rushed toward him, barking its full head off. Its tail swishing furiously, it circled May, back end wiggling as it rubbed up against her. "Who's a good boy?" May cooed in a tone of voice that Wallace despised. "Who's the best boy in the entire world? Is it you? I think it's you." The dog, apparently in agreement that it was the best boy in the entire world, barked cheerfully. Its ears were large and pointed, though the left one flopped over. It collapsed in front of May, rolling over onto its back, legs kicking as May sank to her knees, seeming to disregard the fact that she was wearing a suit, much to Wallace's consternation, rubbing her hands along its stomach. Its tongue lolled out of its mouth as it looked at Wallace. It rolled back over and climbed to its feet, shaking itself from side to side. And then it jumped on Wallace. He barely got his hands up in time before it crashed into him, knocking him off his feet. Wallace landed on his back, trying to shield his face from the frantic, wet tongue licking all the exposed skin it could find. "Help me," he shouted. "It's trying to kill me." "Yeah," May said, "that's not quite what he's doing. Apollo doesn't kill. He loves." She frowned. "Quite a bit, apparently." "Apollo, no, we do not hump people." And then Wallace heard a dry, rusty chuckle followed by a deep, crackly voice. "Don't usually see him so excited. Wonder why that is." Before Wallace could focus on that, the dog jumped off him and took off toward the closed double doors behind the counter. But rather than pushing the doors open, it went through them, the doors unmoving. Wallace sat up in time to see the tip of its tail disappear. The cable from his chest wrapped around the counter, and he couldn't see where it led to. What the hell was that? He demanded, hearing the dog bark somewhere in the house. That was Apollo, May said. But he walked through walls. May shrugged. Well, sure, he's dead like you.